Mr. President, first of all, I would like to commend the chair for coming out with the committee report in timely fashion. Indeed, with the many issues of malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance coming out that require the attention of our oversight functions, I appreciate the efficiency of the chair. I look forward to synergizing our efforts as we are bound by our common aspirations to hold public officials to the highest standards of conduct and to protect the public interest at all times. Hindi na po ako magpapaligoy-ligoy pa. I would like to proceed directly to my questions. Mr. President, I would like to quote from the committee report. Quote, "The SRA supply data and the preponderance of the evidence presented to the committee indicate that there may have been an actual sugar shortage or at the very least anticipated sugar supply shortfalls prior to the issuance of Sugar Order Number 4. Close quote. May have been, or at the very least anticipated sugar supply shortfalls. Hindi pa po sigurado? The good sponsor cited the data from the SRA monitoring unit, and I agree that that data is the best evidence of a shortfall. But, alam po kaya, Mr. President, ng good chairman, na various government agencies, hindi lang po SRA, were already flagging the sugar shortfall. Mr. President, is the chair aware that as early as April 8, 2022, the National Economic Development Authority already flagged the limited supply and the high prices of refined sugar and declared that domestic production of refined sugar is not enough to meet the local demand. Ito po ay nasa liham ni then NEDA Secretary Carl Kendrick Chua kay dating Finance Secretary Carlos Dominguez, dated April 8, 2022. This letter was in response to a request for comments on the letter of Coca-Cola, highlighting the company's supply gap of 116,000 metric tons, Mr. President.
So may we have the question?
Yes, Mr.
And
President.
if the pages
the
referred
question-
to, averted to a while ago in the committee report, can we have that?
Mr. President,
Because
good
it's 75
chair.
pages.
Yes, I am referring to the quote from the committee report on the
Yes.
sugar supply data and the preponderance of the evidence presented to the committee prior to the issuance of Sugar Order Number 4, specifically, Mr. President, page 30. And as a counterpoint to that, and this is my first question, Mr. President, kung aware po yung good share na in fact, as early as April 8, 2022, NEDA already flagged the limited supply. Ito po ay nasa liham ni dating NEDA Secretary Chua, dated April 8, 2022, addressed kay then Finance Secretary Dominguez, pointing out a 116,000 metric ton supply gap ng iisang kumpanya pa lang, ang Coca-Cola, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, I affirm the contents of page 30 of the committee report, though I might not be aware of the letter addressed to Secretary Dominguez, which was not part of the committee report and was never discussed during the committee investigations, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, good chair, and which I am bringing to the attention of this august chamber dahil ibig sabihin po, Abril pa lang, sa iisang kumpanya pa lang na Coca-Cola, meron na po silang hina-highlight na supply gap na 116,000 metric tons. At ito po ay pinansin na ng dating NEDA Secretary Chua sa kanilang sulat kay dating Finance Secretary Dominguez. Abril pa lamang po. 5 months before, Mr. President.
If the purpose of the good member of the minority is to put forward an official letter with the presumption of regularity after the submission of the committee report, we would note that in conjunction with what is contained in page 2 of the NEDA, likewise, which traces the prominent role of the sugar industry in the Philippine economic history. So all of this will have to be pieced together, and if the purpose of the uh, gentle lady is to have this as part of the report, perhaps in the period of amendments, we can incorporate that if indeed the purpose is to establish that there was a sugar shortage, which the report affirmed that there indeed was a sugar shortage. It might be a surplusage, or it might corroborate existing documents made part of this report, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I thank the good chair sa kanilang sinabi na ino-note nila itong sulat pointing out 116,000 metric ton supply gap of just one company months before the events leading up to the sugar order number 4 noted earlier already by then serving government officials na inaasahan ko nga po pagdating sa period of amendments and even during the course of this period of interpellation na yung ganito pong mga nire-raise ko po nitong representation will indeed corroborate not only that there may have been a shortfall or that there was an anticipated shortfall, but that there was already an actually existing. Hindi lang po probable or possible, pero actually existing supply shortage already, Mr. President, good sponsor.
Yes, Mr. President, but then again, I reiterate that
Sponsor.
this was never discussed, never brought up during the committee, several committee hearings, hours of committee hearings, when the, with all due respect, the minority leader had the chance to produce the said document. But then again, if the purpose is to establish the veracity of sugar shortage contained in the committee report, it might be the wish of this committee to note the said document coming from NEDA.
Thank you, good sponsor, Mr. President. What was presented during the hearings was yung SRA data of the past 3 crop years at yung mga resolusyon ng lahat ng mga stakeholders sa sugar industry confirming na may pangangailangang mag-import at halos lahat nila confirming that the supply gap was in the magnitude of 300,000 metric tons. Kaya yung pa lamang po, sapat na po sana sigurong sabihin na there was an actual sugar shortage. Hindi lang po may have been. Pero kung kulang pa sa atin noon yung SRA data of the past 3 crop years at yung mga resolution ng mga sugar industry stakeholders, eto po, let's go back even further to connect further and consistent dots na mula Abril pa lamang ay meron na pong supply gap na pinunana ng ating mga government officials noon. Kaya ito po ay bahagi, kumbaga, binavalidate na rin yung sinasabi ng SRA sa kanilang data of the past 3 crop years. And by the way, Mr. President, good sponsor, nothing precludes members of the committee from raising new points in plenary if pertinent to the report, as this representation so believes and consistent na rin po dun sa ibang mga puntong ni-raise namin sa minority report. Mr. President, good sponsor.
Yes, Mr. President, if I may
Yes,
interrupt.
good sponsor.
If we look at the transcripts, Mr. President, the good Senate President, who is here almost 2 meters from me, delivered a passionate reiteration of his privileged speech that there were several warehouses visited, raided, and the last one was during our last hearing, wherein 400,000 sacks of sugar in Nasugbu, Batangas was uncovered on the same day, Mr. President. So the word, if the question here is why the word May, that was used in the context of contemporaneous events, Mr. President. And if the good gentle lady would recall, during the investigations, this representation was the one who brought out the possibility of perhaps there was indeed no consultations made with the stakeholders. Why? We were able to establish that, and this is a scientific fact, that there was an earthquake. There was an earthquake July 27. And the first job of the official dam of the Department of Agriculture was to attend NDRIMC meetings. The President, as Secretary of Concurrent Secretary of Agriculture, went to Abra, July 28. And this representation raised the point, how come DA, through Yusek Sebastian, was not able to attend any NDRIMC meeting, and yet they were busy with consultations. No consultations were made and established physically, because most of them were saying that they just signed documents, resolutions of support. In fact, there was an insinuation that by Mr. Lamata that he was just made to sign a resolution of support. So what was attributed to a while ago by the lady from Panay probably came from the statements of several SRA officials pointing to a consultation meeting, stakeholders meeting, which never took place. Mr. President. So we were able to establish that because of the confluence of events from an earthquake of July 27 to the date of the supposed to be consultation meeting on July 28. After a few days, DA officials were busy. Lahat po tayo busy. Lahat ng gobyerno busy to respond to that earthquake.
Mr. President, good sponsor, I will return at the end of my interpellation to one of the points raised by the good chair on how much imported sugar has been confiscated and perhaps auctioned off after the raids. But to the immediate points he raised in his recent response to my previous question, were there indeed no consultations? It was also heard by the committee that despite the aftermath of the July 27 earthquake, mayroong pong itinaos na konsultasyon, not July 28 as mentioned by the good chair, but in fact July 29. At kasunod po nun, lahat ng mga stakeholders, and these documents were submitted to the committee as part of the evidence. Lahat po ay humabol dun sa deadline na August 2 to 3 ng kanilang mga rekomendasyon. Even the UniFed, which is led by Mr. Lamata.
Yes,
At lahat po ng mga resolusyon, nakalagay po doon na sinusuportahan ang pag-import at iba't ibang slightly different numbers ang inirekomenda, pero karamihan would gravitate around the magnitude of 300,000.
I agree, Mr. President. Perhaps we differ on the meaning of consultation. Consultation is to ask the other person, the other end, whether you are in agreement or disagreement. What transpired, Mr. President, was the mere submission of resolutions. And as stated, it was August 1, August 2, August 3. No event took place. There were no minutes submitted to the committee as to the consultative meeting that allegedly took place 29 July, Mr. President. Perhaps there were post hoc resolutions submitted to support the plan to have SO number 4 to have a sugar import plan, but in terms of a consultation similar to what is happening right now, we are in a hall. We can talk, we can debate. There was no virtual consultation made. There was no face-to-face consultation made. Even, Mr. President, the dates provided by the distinguished lady, this would show the different responses, August 1, August 2, August 3. So how can you have a consultation on ongoing consultation on various dates? So, Mr. President, we were never able to establish a consultation. But be that as it may, I think this will just point to the preliminaries that what happened before the crafting of SO4 were all done by 3, 4 persons in haste without the presence of other individuals in a consultative manner, Mr. President.
Mr. President, good sponsor. Babalikan po natin yung mga puntong iyon one by one as I interpolate. Let me just go to my second question. Mr. President, in addition to that, yung unang pinag-usapan po natin, good sponsor, na sulat ni dating Sec Chua kay dating Sec Dominguez, April earlier this year. Is the good chair aware that in the June 7, 2022 meeting of the Economic Development Cabinet Cluster meeting, the recommendation made was actually to import 450,000 metric tons of sugar from Thailand and Brazil. And even with the recommended 450,000 metric tons of imported sugar combined with 450,000 metric tons of domestic sugar, there is still a supply deficit of 74,000 metric tons of raw sugar. So, Mr. President, is the good chair aware of this?
Mr. President, I reiterate again, the good gentle lady never brought this to the attention of the committee during the several hearings we conducted. This just came out today, Mr. President. I could not even read that. But, Mr. President, we're giving a presumption of regularity here. This was never tackled during the Blue Ribbon investigations. We were never able to have this document as part of the exhibits. We were never able to show this to the former Sugar Regulatory Agency officials. So if this is a newly discovered evidence, it has to be placed in the right perspective. Ano po ang gusto palabasin? Ang gusto pong palabasin, may shortfall. We agree. Ang gusto pong palabasin, meron document noong June which we were never able to verify, although again we grant a presumption of regularity here, and this was never discussed. This was never. I don't know if the rules will permit us to overhaul the mark evidence exhibits which were never shown during the committee hearings. Otherwise, Mr. President, I might be able to raise a point of order here. The committee report is the one that is supposed to be tackled here. Although the notion of sugar shortage is germane to the committee report, the document being presented virtually was never part of the committee investigation. So, Mr. President, it would be highly irregular for this representation to discuss something which was not part of the committee investigation wherein the gentle lady from Panay participated intensively, and we appreciate her participation. So if there will be other documents that will be shown, perhaps it would be tantamount to having another committee hearing when we have already adjourned, Mr. President, weeks ago. And in fact, the submission of the committee report and the 2-day rule to submit a minority report or a dissent for that matter would encapsulate the rule that everything would have to be there. So extrinsic matters not part of the committee report, not part of the investigation, although germane, especially when it refers to documents, probably would be beyond the purview of this representation's knowledge. So the questions and the succeeding questions would be to ask me if I am aware. Mr. President, my continuing answer is that I am not aware because this was never presented, Mr. President.
Mr. President, good sponsor, with all due respect to the good chair, if the chair were to raise a point of order on this matter, with all due respect, as a member of the Blue Ribbon Committee, it would be out of order because this is not yet possibly this is not yet our final committee report. Kaya nga po ini-interpellate natin. Kaya nga po pagkatapos nitong period of interpellation, dadako po tayo sa period of amendment in order to come up with the final committee report. Kaya nga po nagko-content kami mula sa minorya to present yung mga punto ng aming minority report para sa konsiderasyon. Hindi lamang ng good share, pero ng lahat pa po ng mga colleagues dito sa Senado. All committee reports are up for debate in plenary and indeed subject to amendment by the body. Nagpapasalamat po ako sa good share for conceding that may shortfall. He agreed that there was a shortfall. And that these documents that I am asking the good share about in interpellation of the draft committee report are germane. Para sa akin po, it should have been enough
Mr.
to
President,
establish the shortage, to say even in the committee report what the chair has now said, that there was my shortfall, sang-ayon ang chair doon. But since the draft committee report has not yet stated that, andun pa lang siya sa may have been a shortage, kaya nga germane itong mga dokumentong ito to show what this representation believes is already established by the SRA data of the past 3 crop years at yung mga resolusyon ng mga stakeholders, just to continue connecting the dots even in the earlier months, even from the previous administration. So, I correct myself, Mr. President, good chair, the committee report is not a draft.
yes.
It is
yes.
not yet
I
adopted
was
by
supposed
this
to
august chamber.
respond, Mr.
Yes,
President,
Mr.
because
President, it's not yet
15
adopted.
members signed
So
this committee
subject,
report.
yes, Mr. Chair, I have corrected myself, Mr. President, but it is not yet adopted by the Senate. Kaya nga po, nag-i-interpellate pa po tayo, papasok pa po sa period of amendments. Kaya po, pinepresenta po nitong representasyon itong mga dokumento as germane, as said by the chair, in the period of interpellation, Mr. President.
Mr. President, if I may react quickly.
Please proceed.
If we will allow the presentation of new documents to support the contention of the lady from Panay, what would prevent another member of the Blue Ribbon Committee? Thank you, Senator De La Rosa. What would prevent another member of the Blue Ribbon Committee to present the testimony of witnesses? How would you balance the scale between a documentary evidence and testimonial evidence? Will we allow here in the plenary, as we discuss the committee report, the presentation of witnesses who will support Undersecretary Sebastian, who will rebut the testimony of Mr. Serapica? So will we now be discriminating against the testimonial evidence if we will allow the presentation of documentary evidence, Mr. President? So will we allow now the presentation of witnesses here in the plenary, Mr. President, after we have submitted the committee report? Because we are now, if we will accept additional documentary evidence, we might as well accept testimonial evidence. We might as well recall Yusek Sebastian and the entire SRA board here. So this will be an unending investigation, Mr. President. Can we have a ruling on that, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President, thank you to the good chair for his generosity, but in point of fact, for the record, this representation is not planning to present new witnesses in plenary. For the record, Mr. President. And by the way, Mr. President, good chair, as the chair asked earlier, these documents were only given to me after the termination of the investigation. At siguro naman, ay pwede pa rin po silang siyasatin in this period of interpellation, Mr. President.
May we have a ruling, Mr. President? Will we allow the presence of additional witnesses?
I am not going
In
to
the-
present any, Mr. President, good chair.
Yes, we
Audit. Of course, Mr. President, these cases are quite new, so we should not fault the chair if he does not know of these new cases. Pero
I
wag
take
po
offense,
tayong...
Mr. President, to that attribution, Mr. President.
No, I apologize, Mr.
My lack
President.
of
No
knowledge
offense,
should not
ma'am.
be implicated here.
No,
I have a law exam on Tuesday.
Yes,
so I'm
Mr.
still a law student right now. Perhaps your staff are not the law students here.
Well,
so,
Mr. President, I am
move
not
that,
a lawyer
That
myself.
phrase should be deleted from the records, Mr. President.
I have no
If there
objection
is
to deleting,
If there is
Mr.
an
President.
incumbent law student here, I am the one. I am the
Miss-
one. I
May I ask
challenge
for 1
you.
minute
I
Whoever
apologize
is
to the good
whispering
chair. No
you.
offense.
So, Mr. President, thank you to the Secretariat. Mr. President, to clarify it once and for all, it can be a defense. However, when all the elements of the offense under Article 177 are present, good faith is negated. So, there are 4 elements under 177. Offender may be a private or public officer. Pasok. Offender performs any act pertaining to a person, authority, or public officer of the Philippine government or any of its agencies or foreign government. Pasok. Number 3, offender performs the act under the pretense of public function. Hazy. Number 4, offender performs the act without being legally entitled to do so. Dito po sa number 4, siguro po kinulang yung 4th element, so good faith can be negated. Mr. President, ang dami po nating testigo noon, kabilang po yung dating executive secretary, na sinasabi naman niya, hindi naman talaga siya, bagamat nandun sa Memorandum 15, yung pagpirma niyang yon ay hindi siya inauthorize pa ng executive. Ganon din po yung perception ni na Mr. Serafica at ni na Mr. Valderrama at Attorney Beltran na ang akala nila ay authorized nga, kaya nagpirmahan din sila. So, the elements, all the elements should be present, but here we have element 3 and 4 which are on the borderline. So, good faith can be negated, Mr. President.
Mr. President, good sponsor. Well, I see the majority leader maybe approaching. But for the record, before this may be suspended for today, Mr. President, good sponsor. For the record, akala ko hindi po lilitisin tulad ng isang korte. Wag naman po sana po ang aking hiling, wag naman po sana nating sabihin na good faith can be negated. Minsan po, kapag po yung mga posibleng inosente ay inaakusahan ng mga krimen na posibleng hindi naman nila ginawa, minsan po, Mr. President, good faith na lang yung huling depensa nila. At wag naman po sana nating ipagkait yon sa kanila dahil nga sabi ng good share din, Mr. President, hindi po tayo korte. Sapat na po sana iwan natin na good, yung sinabi po ng chair kanina na aking ipinagpapasalamat na good faith can be used as a defense dito sa Article 177 ng revised Penal Code. As I said a few times, Mr. President, in the course of this initial interpellation, I'm not a lawyer, so I do not wish to belabor these legal points, but I do this because of a more critical point I'd like to make as an advocate for Filipino consumers and Filipino workers. This disproportionately punitive response by the executive against civil servants like Yusek Sebastian produces a chilling effect and discourages officials from acting with dispatch on issues as critical as prices and supply of important household commodities. At pag ganito po, Mr. President, ang talo po dito ang mamamayang Pilipino. Mr. President, good sponsor.
Mr.
Mr.
President,
President.
just a quick reaction that the element number 4 never came from me. It's part of People versus Uy, GR 248566, August 4, 2021, a decision of the Philippine Supreme Court, Mr. President. And as an additional reply, Mr. President, kaya nga po tayo nagbibigay ng ngipin sa pagbibigay ng rekomendasyon na mayroong maimbestigahan at parusahan para patunayan sa ating mga kababayan na hindi naman tayo nagiging lax sa ating oversight function at meron pa rin batas na dapat sundin. Kung lahat po ay tayo ay maaawa at patatawarin na lang natin lahat, ay wag na po tayong baka pumayag si Senator De La Rosa na dating Bucor, tanggalin na yung mga padlock sa piitan. Kung kaawaan na natin lahat. So, kailangan po yung dapat parusahan, parusahan.
Sponsor.
Mr. President, can interject because if I may be allowed to interject, because that was the speech that I made, and that was the source of the investigation of the Blue Ribbon Committee. With due respect to the members of the minority, and of course with respect to our chairperson, I think my dear colleague Senator Risa is invoking the issue on workers' rights and civil servants. But the real issue here, Mr. President, is the farmers, which are the ones that are affected by all this sugar importation. We already know that. We've established that any sugar importation is detrimental, of course, to the livelihood of over 100,000 farmers, 1 million beneficiaries, including the farm workers, and probably about 5 million people. We have to put it in proper perspective. We in the Senate have in the past investigated things of lesser, I'd say lesser, not crime, but lesser action. Here is a situation, Mr. President, wherein overeager members of the SRA immediately wanted to go for an importation when there was clearly no instruction from the President, usurping his authority by signing on his behalf. I have nothing against Yusek Sebastian. I hear he's a very good man in terms of, and very well respected with the agri sector. Ang akin lang dyan, we've investigated lesser crimes. And the minority, and Senator Risa, together with Senator Coco and the other members of the minority before, investigated other issues on a mere whim or whiff of corruption. Here's malfeasance, misfeasance. We caught the hand in the cookie jar. Di ba? Natanggal. Nahuli. So, binaliktad nila. And they're saying now good faith. Tama po sinabi ni Chairman Tolentino. Kung papayagan natin sila na, we'll work on good faith, then maybe half the cases that will be filed in the Blue Ribbon Committee, including in the Ombudsman, baka good faith lang naman talaga sila. But the findings are otherwise. And the chairperson says, it's time that it will be heard in a proper forum. Let them defend themselves in the proper forum. Right? So, I do not understand why we're defending people who clearly got their hands caught in the cookie jar. Now, if they say we were misled, then the proper courts, let them say it, that we were misled to believe that the President wanted this. But coming from all sources, including them, the President never asked for this. The Executive Secretary never asked for this. He asked for a sugar plan, and what is your plan for importation? Now, the facts have come out, ang kailangan pala 150,000 metric tons lamang. Hindi 300,000 metric tons. Kasi kung 300,000 metric tons, the country will be awash with sugar. Negros, Bukidnon, Cavite, Batangas, Iloilo, Capiz, all of them will be suffering now because of too much sugar. Kaya I think the bottom line is, let us not lose focus on our farmers. Yung ating mga magsasaka ang ating tulungan dito. May ginawa po tayong hakbang para hindi masobra ng importation. Di ba, pinaglalaban natin po ang mga magsasaka. Ayaw po natin ng importation galing China. Ng gulay, ng karne, ng manok, dahil gusto natin tulungan ang ating mga magsasaka dito. So let's not protect a few who are pro-importation, even if it is in good faith. But obviously, nakita naman po natin, may usurpation of authority. I know of civil servants who come to me and ask for help, asking pardon from the President and all sorts of pakiusap sa justice, sa judiciary. Sabi ko, hindi ko magagawa yan. Let them defend themselves. They're asking for help for mere usurpation of authority lamang. Pumirma sila on behalf of the mayor. Pumirma sila on behalf of the accountant or auditor in the town. Kulong. Ito, pumirma for 300,000 metric tons worth billions of pesos, Your Honors, of importation. Galit nga tayo dun sa money, yung peanut importation. Yung, may hiling po kami ni Senator Villar before, nalaman namin yung head ng Bureau of, Plant Industry was a former barangay captain, totally underqualified for the post, and yet, import ng import. Galit na galit kami. Gusto namin matigil yun. So ngayon, naitigil na. Pero, imbis na parusahan natin, pabayaan natin, we give them a slap on the wrist. Let them explain to the proper authorities why they did such action without the approval of the approving authority. I think that's fair. Di ba po? Your Honors. Yeah.
The minority leader is
Yes,
recognized.
Mr. President, thank you. I am forced to react because the Senate President said that the minority, the two of us, have caused the investigation on a mere whim or on a mere whiff of corruption. And what is that?
I said members of the Senate, including the minority.
But not this minority. We will never act on a whim, Mr. President.
Yeah, but in the
we
former...
just give you that assurance that we will never
we appreciate
act
the
on a
answer.
whim. So.
But I said, members of the Senate, including the minority, in the past, we've any...
No, we were named, Mr. President. You named us, eh. That's why I am reacting. But ganito kasi I will schedule my interpellation on the on the majority report of the sugar probe next time. But let me react lang on the inputs from the Senate President. Ang ayaw nga sana natin maging parang piskal the prosecutor's office na, which is probably part of the problem of our justice system. Yung kay judge ka na magpaliwanag. Ayaw natin ng ganun. Kasi kung talagang walang dahilan na kasuhan, wag nating kasuhan kasi it adds to the clogging of court dockets. Yan po yung attitude or perspective na dala namin dun po sa aming minority report. Sana po maintindihan po ninyo na ganun po yung perspektibong dala namin.
Pero,
Wag
Your
tayo
Honor,
doon na, sige, doon ka na kay Judge.
No, but with due respect, Mr. President, this is only recommendatory to the Ombudsman. We're not taking this, we're not filing the case to the judge. We're giving the recommendation to the Ombudsman for further action. If we do not do that, inutil po tayo sa oversight function ng Blue Ribbon.
That's, yes.
That's our complaint before with the family
Again-
issue of the former Blue Ribbon Committee. Di ba? That was the complaint. So,
Mr. President.
I suggest na we act on the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon, come up with our opinion on plenary, but eventually we have to move further from what had happened in the past, which is basically non-action of these particular reports. Let's act on it, we vote on it, send it as a recommendation, and let the proper authorities decide if it needs further action.
So, but we will, when it's my turn to interpolate, I will explain the philosophy that we brought behind the minority report. It's an attitudinal change that we want to happen, Mr. President. And
The sponsor wants to be recognized.
Yeah.
It's
Yes,
recognized.
just a mere clarification, Mr. President. We acknowledge the intensive participation of the minority and perhaps the good Senate President when he mentioned the word whim, although can be misquoted and misinterpreted, would probably refer to the intensive participation of the minority. I recall, Mr. President, even the minority leader himself was the one who said, if I may quote him, the gist is this: whatever the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee does here will be reflective of the integrity of the Senate. I quote that. That's part of the TSN. There's a video of that. And I recall, Mr. President, it was even the minority who insisted that a subpoena be issued to the former executive secretary. And we agreed with the minority to have the executive secretary be present. And within more than an hour, he was indeed present. So all of these collaborative efforts led to the production of this majority report, Mr. President. They were given the first crack to answer questions, to ask questions, and the last questions, the summation questions coming from the gentle lady from Panay and even the minority leader, Mr. President. All of these are parts of the record, Mr. President. So the majority report was part of a collaborative effort, and the whim probably expressed something to do with the intensive participation of the minority, Mr. President.